All right, welcome everybody. Tonight is lesson number 12, and it's the last, I guess you would say, in the cycle, but a new beginning afterwards. The system just keeps repeating itself. We're doing two things tonight, really. One, or today, what we're doing today is we're going to be finishing off the methods of appraisal. And then we're going to move into some of the construction terms that you're likely to see on the state exam. As a short recap, last week we talked about appraisal theory, and we also talked about the market data, also known as the comparison approach, which looks at past sales of similar properties. The cost approach uses today's costs to build buildings and to buy land. And the income approach looks at the future income of the building, which is, by the way, I think the most fun, the income approach. So just to conceptualize this, what we have is past, present, and future in terms of how we're analyzing the value of a property. So let's start with capitalization. The word capitalization comes from the Latin word, well, capita. And that means head. Like if you were guilty of a capital offense, that was one they would, cut your head off for. And of course, the top of a column is called the capital. Well, anyhow, one way to think of capitalization, because capita means head, is to think of, well, the headwaters, right? So we have a stream that flows out of a lake. And that lake is the headwaters for that river or stream. And if you were going to buy the lake because you wanted the water, how would you determine the value of the lake? And the answer is by the size of the stream that flows from the lake and the likelihood of how long it was going to flow in the future. If I'm an investor and I'm buying investment property, what essentially I'm buying is the headwaters. I'm buying the headwaters from which a stream of income is going to flow into the future. And the value of that income producing property is determined by the size of the stream and the length of time it is likely to flow. Capitalization is used on income producing properties. Now, some people really hate this subject. I'm just saying some people hate the subject. And especially if you're just interested in doing residential real estate and we're talking about cap rates and all that other kind of stuff, you may just, so I want you to know that if you don't understand capitalization and you don't like capitalization and you don't ever want to do capitalization, you can still make a lot of money in real estate. And whenever you get multifamily properties or commercial properties, well, you could just refer them to me, right? Because others may be interested in this and say, oh, I understand this. I think this is interesting. I could see myself doing it. Talk to me after you get your license because I do commercial real estate as well. And what capitalization does, it establishes the present worth of the future benefits. What would you pay? I'll give you an example. I have one coming up. I'll wait for that example. Forecasting. Now, the income approach looks at future income, but knowing the future, well, sometimes that's hard to do. So it forecasts by looking at past and current trends. That's forecasting. So rarely, but has been on the state exam, the Department of Real Estate is asked a question in appraisal that says, in Wood and Haas Gold, what did those two clowns do? They didn't say clowns. And the answer is they dealt with the capitalization approach. And Haas Gold uses something called the sinking fund. I'll explain that, but these are not the most common questions. Let me give you an example then of how capitalization works. Think about, let's say you owned a machine. And that machine legally prints money. Now you have to pay a licensing fee to the government for the use of the machine. You have to buy government ink and government paper. And, there's expenses involved. But after it's all said and done, every year this machine makes $100,000 of net income. $100,000. I would like to buy that machine from you. Would you sell it to me? You might be saying, well, for how much? How about this? $100,000. Would you sell me a machine that makes $100,000 a year for $100,000? Probably not, right? Because you're going to be saying, well, it makes that every year, and this machine is in good condition, is going to last a long time. I only use it on the weekends to make small bills, that sort of thing. How about 500,000? If I gave you $500,000, would you give me the machine that makes $100,000 a year? I'm probably getting warmer. How about $1 million? I got it, $1 million right here. If you'll give me the machine, sell me the machine that makes $100,000 a year. Let's say I've hit your number and you're like, yeah, I'll do that. Give me $1 million and the machine is yours. So the value of this machine is $1 million. The income that the machine is making is $100,000 a year. Now, the math, this part isn't very difficult. What is my rate of return? Well, if I'm getting $100,000 on if I'm making $100,000 on $1 million investment, I'm making 10% a year. The rate times the value equals the income. So the rate of return is 10% times the value of the property, which is 1 million, equals the income of the property, which is $100,000. All right, cool. But we're doing an appraisal class. And in appraisal, what is it that the appraiser is hired to determine? Do appraisers determine the income that properties produce? No, that's not their thing. Do appraisers determine the rate of return that investors want on an investment? And the answer is no, the market determines that. So if I'm the appraiser, which of these parts of the formula am I trying to solve for? And of course, the answer is the value, because we're talking about appraisal, which is value. Now, the good news is that for some of you, the Department of Real Estate doesn't have math questions hardly ever on the state licensing exam, right? They don't have math questions, right? So you're not going to probably get one, right? Occasionally they've had one math question, but it has been a year or so since anybody has gotten a math question on the California state real estate exam, over more than a year. So when I was teaching arithmetic, however, to people that are not already good at it, I used to tell people that the way to think of this is rate times value equals income is a straight line equation. And a straight line equation would be something like 2 times 3 equals 6. I hope I'm not going too fast for anybody. 2 times 3 equals 6. And the reason I'm using this is that if the 3 were missing, if we were told your job is to figure out what this unknown number is, we know that when you multiply it by 2, it equals 6. How would you find the missing number? If the 3 was missing, how would you find that number? Well, you would take the 6 and you would divide it by the 2. So if the value is missing, you take the income and you divide it by the rate. This is what I call ERV. I divided by R equals V. And income divided by rate equals value is the capitalization formula. And what that formula does is it converts income into value based upon a given rate. On the state exam, they oftentimes like to do it this way, where value equals the income divided by the rate. It's the same formula. Right? So capitalization is the process of expressing anticipated future benefits in dollars and discounting them to a present worth. That's called capitalization. It converts income into value. More income, more value, less income, less value. Anticipated future benefits in dollars and discounting them to a present worth. What that line is getting at is that there's a difference in the value of present money versus future money. Present money is worth more than future money. Now, if that's a difficult concept, let me put it a different way. Supposing you won the lottery, $30 million, right? Great, you won the lottery. They're going to give you two choices. One choice is you're going to get $30 million, but you're going to get it at $1 million a year for the next 30 years. That's option number one. Option number two is 15 million right now. Right now, 15 million. Which one do you think most people pick? And the answer is they take the 15 million right now. If you're thinking, well, I would have done that too, or even I would have waited all 30 years because I'm young, I'll maybe be able to use, but you could probably understand why people would rather have 15 million now than to wait 30 years to get 30. If you understand that, you understand capitalization. Because what we're doing is we're taking this future income stream and discounting it down to today's value. And by the way, it is not uncommon that the number of years is between 5 and 10. I'm just saying, right? So when I get the rates, 5%, 10% cap rate, you understand that 10% a year times 10 years, you would have gotten all the money, right? I'll talk more about that later. An appraiser who is appraising lease property would review the contract provisions. That's just a line from something that's been on the state exam. Capitalization determines the value of an asset by dividing the anticipated income by the desired rate of return. These are restating the same thing, but these are all different ways that this has appeared on the state exam. There are 3 steps. The capitalization rate is established. This is the most difficult step. I've actually seen other people's material on preparing for the real estate exam, and they saw the question, and the question was of the capitalization approach, which is the most difficult step. And some of my competitors picked net income, which is wrong. Not only do I say it's wrong, the Department of Real Estate reference book says it's wrong, and the Institute of Real Estate Appraisal says it's wrong. Capitalization, the rate, is the most difficult step. When we get to that, which is coming up, you'll see why. Then step 2 is we determine the net income. And then step 3, we divide. By the way, on the state exam, they have a question asking which of the following is the correct formula for determining capitalization, and they don't even spell out the words. They don't say value equals income divided. They say V equals I divided by R. They wanted you to pick the initials. Now, there's no math on the state exam, probably, but I'm going to do a quick little math example just because it's torture. I mean, just so it would demonstrate how this would work. So if we have an income property valued at $800,000, this is how the Department of Real Estate would ask these questions. Capitalized at a rate of 9%. There's a new investor who wants to purchase the same property and hired an appraiser who used a cap rate of 12%. So is the value going to go up or is the value going to go down? Let's see. So what is the value? Well, what they didn't tell us when they told us 800,000 and 9%, notice they didn't tell us the income, right? They never here told us what the income is. And in order for us to determine the value, we have to take the income and divide it by the rate. So how would we find the income? Well, we know that the value was 800,000. And we know that the rate was 9%. So if we take rate times value equals income, we get an income of 72,000. Now that we have the income, we have a new rate of 12%. So we take that income, divide it by the new rate, 12%, and we get a new value, 600,000. You'll see as the rate goes up, the value goes down, assuming the income remains the same. So the capitalization rate is the ratio between the value and the income. It is dependent upon the return which investors demand before they're attracted to an investment. How would we determine that? We would analyze market prices and interest rates in the financial marketplace. That's how we would do it. So if we're, and by the way, this is something that I was doing yesterday with one of my, the agents that I work with is buying a 7-unit apartment building, is where what would be an appropriate cap rate? Well, if we looked at other buildings that have sold and we knew how much income they were making, we could figure out what the capitalization rate is for that kind of property in that particular area. We're also going to use the interest rate demanded in the financial marketplace. That's coming up. I'll show you why. So capitalization rate could be, there's many different methods, but there's the summation method. I have an example coming up. Investors add both their desired return and adjustments to come up with a cap rate. The band of investment. The band of investment looks at equity and financing. All right. Comparison is the most common method. So let's start with that. I'm going to give you an example that deals with summation. Comparison means we're appraising a multifamily unit building in the town. What do multifamily unit buildings like that typically produce in terms of net income, and when they sell in terms of the sales price? And if we know their income and we know their value, we can find their rate. That's the most common method. What rate of return have similar properties been getting? But let's say you're appraising a 1,500 unit apartment building. What would you do? Would you look at past sales of 1,500 unit apartment buildings? How many 1,500 unit apartment buildings do you guess sell in any particular town in any year? And the answer is probably none. 2, maybe none. 3 years, none. 4 years, none, right? You're saying maybe a long time, 10, 20 years, nobody's ever sold a 1,500 unit apartment building. And so the question is, how would the appraiser determine what rate of return would be useful for that particular building? How would they determine that? And I sometimes say that the whole cap rate is monkey see, monkey do, in that it's investors parroting, I guess I'm mixing my animal metaphors, mimicking, how about that? Mimicking what if other investors are getting something, they want to get that. What other investors are getting, that's what I want to get, because why shouldn't I get as much as they? Right? It's also known as the market. So we have a 1,500 unit apartment building. None of them have ever sold, maybe ever in this town. How would we determine a cap rate? Well, let's find some monkeys, big apes, that might have an idea. How about a bank? Supposing we found a bank that lends on properties like that. And we asked the bank, would you lend me money to buy a multifamily unit apartment? And they said, yes, we would. Cool. How much would you lend me? And let's say they say, well, loan to value ratio and something like that might be 6%, 60%. What interest rate would you charge me? They say, well, we would charge at least 10% on a loan like that. Now, you understand, they've given me something. This is called the band of investment. They've given me something. And by the way, the way band of investment works, it's like Neapolitan ice cream. You're familiar, right? Neapolitan ice cream is the ice cream, with the 3 flavors. Have you ever noticed, like, when you have ice cream like that, you look at it in the fridge and in the freezer, and somebody in the house has tunneled out like one of the flavors because that's the one they like, right? And I don't know if that's ever happened, but so my point is that there are 3 flavors, and some people like one flavor over the other. So one flavor in our investment is the 60% loan that the bank would make at 10%. Well, what else would we do? Maybe we could find lenders who make second loans on properties like this, 20%. What interest rate would they charge? Will they say, we charge you at least 12%? So we now have a second flavor, and that flavor is the flavor of the second position loan. Higher interest rate, but more risk. What's the third flavor? The third flavor is the investor's investment and the return on their equity. What do they want? Well, they want more than the first. The first may be the first, but it's going to be first to be paid. They're going to want more than the second because the second will be second to be paid. So let's say that would be 20% of your own money and you expect to get 14% or whatever the market would bear for that kind of investment. You understand, by analyzing those three flavors, we can determine an overall return on the investment. Did I say that the cap rate is the most difficult part? Well, the greater the risk, the higher the rate. I'm going to give an example in a minute. Quantity, quality, and durability of the rent are considered. I have a YouTube channel and I have a video on it called How to Analyze Investment Properties. My YouTube channel is Upthink Real Estate, if you were wondering, you wanted to go watch it. And this was a class that I'd done for real estate agents, and the question I would ask real estate agents is, when we capitalize something, what are we capitalizing? Are we capitalizing the building? Are we capitalizing the land? Are we capitalizing the land and the building? Are we capitalizing the leases? And the answer is, well, it's the leases. We're capitalizing the leases. I'll give you an example. 2 properties you could own. One property is in a rundown area. The building isn't in particularly great shape. It's kind of close to the airport and a little bit noisy. It's a warehouse type building. Amazon just signed a 15-year lease on that building. How many of you would like to have that building? Amazon just signed a long-term lease. Most investors would raise their hand. So I have another building that you could buy, same amount. It's a beautiful building in a high traffic, nice area. But that building has been vacant for the last 3 years. Which building would you rather own? Most people would say, I'll go with the one that Amazon has signed the lease. So what we're capitalizing is not the building, because the building by itself doesn't produce money. We're capitalizing the lease of the building, right? Because that's where the income is generated. And we want to know the quantity of the rent, but we also want to know the quality of the tenant. And we want to know the length or durability of the lease. By the way, if that lease to Amazon only had 3 years left, if that was all that was left of Amazon's lease, would you be looking at that old building next to the airport a little bit differently? In fact, it's not uncommon in commercial real estate that when the buyer purchases a property, a condition is negotiating an extension of the leases. Right. The capitalization, so let's look at 2 examples. Right? The first, over here on the left, we have a building. And even though it's a lavender field around it, it was supposed to be green, but it's a long story. So the purple part, let's say it's a lavender landscaping. All right. The building has a limited economic life. And an economic life of the building means the period of time from when the building is built to when the building is no longer worth its upkeep. Now, the physical life of the building can be a lot longer. Think of it like a racehorse, right? A racehorse has a limited economic life, right? The idea is that, how long do horses like this, are they able to run races and still win? Versus 3 years. Okay. So at the end of the 3 years, the horse isn't going to be dead. Right? It'll still be, in the stable, out in the field, but it isn't going to be running anymore, right? The physical life of the horse is longer than the economic life of the horse. The physical life of a building is longer than the economic life of the building. There's a saying in appraisal that more buildings are torn down than fall down. And the reason we don't wait for a building that just collapses into the dirt typically. right? That's usually not the plan, at least. When the building reaches a point where it is no longer worth its upkeep, it's torn down and replaced with another building. Now, when we're appraising a building, we want to know how much is remaining economic life. So the guy says to you, well, the horses like this generally, can run competitively for 3 years. Cool, you say. How long have you been racing this one? 2.5 years. Oh, that's not good, right? Because it's, on its last. So how much remaining life is there in the building? Let's say the building has a 20-year remaining economic life. That means that the investor would need to get 5% a year in order to just break even. This is the Inwood and Hoskell guys, right? This is this. So if I got 5% a year for 20 years, I would get 100% of my investment back. I would break even. So I need 5% a year just to break even. But I don't want to just break even, right? There's no reason to get out of bed if all I'm going to do is break even that day. I might as well just hang even. Well, once I get up, I might as well just stay there. I want to get a return on my investment. How would the investor come up with that monkey see? What are the other investors getting? What are they doing? I want to get what they're getting. So let's say the market is getting a 10% rate, which is pretty high. A 10% rate is a return on the investment. That's 15%. And that 15% would be an example of a summation capitalization rate. That would be an example. Now, remember I said a couple times that the cap rate is the most difficult part. I'll give you an example. Would the cap rate for the land be the same cap rate as the building? And the answer is no. Why not? Because land does not have a limited economic life. It'll be here when we're gone. So land doesn't have a limited economic life, so there's no need to get a return of the investment for the land. It's not going anywhere. We only need to get a return on the investment. So that means if you're fine tuning this, you would want to do, it's complicated. I said this is the most difficult part. Usually what we do in reality is we just find other multifamily or other retail or other office buildings that have sold, and we see the range of capitalization rates, and we pick one of those. Remember we said that the greater the risk, the higher the rate. Remember that line? So there's a question on the state exam, and the question is about a post office and a hardware store. Now, to get yourself into this question, let's say a rich uncle died and left you $5 million. And you've decided you want to buy a commercial building and just that's already rented because you don't want to have to deal with that. And you never want to work again, right? All you want is every week, every month to walk out to the mailbox, right, with your house coat and bunny slippers on to get your check. That's all you want to do. So there are two buildings. Both of these buildings were built at the same time by the same builder. They're right next to each other. They're the same age, they're the same square footage, and roughly the same layout. Both buildings have just signed a 20-year lease. The same leasing company represented both buildings. The leases are identical to each other. The amount of rent being charged is identical. The only difference between these two buildings is who the tenant is. One of the building's tenants is the United States Postal Service. The other one is an independent hardware store. Which building, you never want to have to work again, which building would you probably want to own? And the answer is usually the post office. By the way, on the state exam, it's the post office. And the reason is because it's a government lease and we're going to run out of money before they do. Isn't that right? Now, the hardware guy may have never missed a payment, always been on time, right? Seems like a good, a good egg and all that sort of thing, but they are putting in a new Lowe's not too far away. And Walmart is talking about a superstore in the neighborhood. You understand that guy could be on the ropes. So what would happen, there's a higher risk to the hardware store. So if both buildings are on the market for $5 million, most people would buy the one with the post office stamp. So the guy that has the hardware store building is going to have to negotiate. And he might say, look, our buildings are the same, the rent is the same, the lease is the same. I realize the other building's a stronger tenant than mine, but I'll sell you my hardware building for $4,500. $500,000. You'll save $500,000. You get the same building, you get the same rent. Buy a few, some nice cars and go on a trip. Now, the question on the exam is about which one has the higher risk and which one has the higher rate. The lower risk belongs to the post office. It also would have a lower rate of return. The hardware store, if the income remains the same, but the hardware store person lowers their price, that increases the rate of return. A higher risk is a higher rate of return. A lower risk is the lower rate of return. So I ask this question to real estate agents when I'm, preaching and doing this class. What is best if you represent an investor, a high cap rate or a low cap rate? Right? In real estate, high cap rate is better. The high cap rate means there's a higher risk. And this varies in California depending on the county you're in. But in many counties in California, multifamily residential properties have a cap rate between 3-4%. Sometimes almost 5%, but usually it's less than 5% as a cap rate. That's low, I'm telling you, right? Retail cap rates could be 7.5 to 10, so 3 to 4 is low. Why is it so low? And the answer is because it's almost a zero risk investment. Right, given affordability in California and the number of people that are renting and the ability to raise rent up to 10% a year and all that other kind of stuff, you understand it's considered to be just a sure thing kind of investment. Very low risk. It has a lower rate of return. Retail space and office space and certain other kinds of spaces which are harder to fill the tenants if they were to leave, that's a higher risk and there would be a higher rate of return. All right. When interest rates increase, cap rates increase. Really? So why would that be? Well, remember, the investors are looking at lenders for guidance on what kind of rate of return should they expect on a particular investment. And if the lender apes say, we want more money, we want more money, we want more money than the littler ones, the private investors say, well, we want more money too. Everybody's making more money, we want more money. As the capitalization rate increases, the value goes down. And that's because the perspective, the income isn't going up. Right, but as cap rates go up, the demand of investors is going up, but the income isn't going up. Therefore, the value is less. In fact, there is a question on the estate exam: if net income is constant, but interest rates increase, the value of the equity goes down. That's because if interest rates go up, cap rates go up. And if cap rates go up, but the income isn't going up, the value is going down. The capitalization rate is a return on the investment and a return of the investment. And that's really looking at depreciation that Inwood and Hoskell got, right? So Inwood, Hoskell was saying, well, the 5%, we ought to have a percentage and put it in the rate. Inwood was saying, why don't we take some of the money every year and we'll put it into what's called a sinking fund, which would be like a bank account that pays interest, and we'll put the money there, and then when the building wears out. So just to make sure I'm being clear, see that line going down? The return of the investment, that 5%, because the building has a 20-year remaining life, is an accrual for the future depreciation of the building. Does everybody see that? That 5% return of the investment is looking at the future depreciation of the. Selecting a capitalization rate is the most difficult part. Don't let anybody, it's the most difficult part. All right. So income divided by rate equals the value. All right, cool. So let's talk about income. Let's say that you owned an apartment building. How many sets of books would you want to keep? Sometimes people say, well, I'd like two. One for me, one for the IRS. You know, a risky proposition. Excuse me. Some people I've had people say two. One for me, one for my partner. Yeah, that's nice. So we're going to kind of talk about 3 sets of books. We're going to talk about the operating income that the appraiser is looking at to divide by the rate in order to determine the value. That's called net operating income. And that looks at the future. So let's say we have a 50-unit apartment building and we were appraising it. We would start with what's called scheduled gross. And what scheduled gross would be if all 50 units were always rented 100% of the time and everybody paid their rent on time, what would that be? That number is scheduled gross. Those are the dollars that we could get. However, we know it's not always going to be rented and not everybody's going to pay their rent on time. So we would then subtract a factor for vacancies and uncollected rents. Those are the dollars we won't get. If we took the dollars we could get and then we subtracted the dollars we won't get, we're going to end up with the dollars we will get. And that's called effective gross. Now, from effective gross, we're going to subtract expenses. There are fixed expenses, and fixed expenses mean these are expenses that do not vary based upon occupancy of the building, property taxes. If your 50-unit apartment building is half empty, is it going to help you to call the tax assessor up and complain? Say, hey, you know, my building is half empty. You guys ought to cut my property. They don't, they'll laugh. You know, can I put you on speakerphone? Ask that again. And everybody laugh. They're going to laugh. But no, they don't care, right? You understand? It's not based upon your vacancy factor. It's a fixed expense. How about your insurance premiums? Would you, if your building was half empty, would you call the insurance company up and tell them and ask for a discount? Sometimes they'll cancel you or raise your rates because there's more vacancy means more chance. There's more arson in vacant buildings. But without getting into that, can you see that insurance and property taxes are fixed in that they do not vary based upon occupancy? Now, if you went through the books of the apartment building, you could find check stubs or electronic check stubs for the money that was paid for property taxes and insurance premiums. So those are dollars that are paid out. What else do we have? We have variable expenses. Variable expenses, well, they vary. Advertising, rubbish removal, maintenance, utilities, things like that. So again, if we went through the books of the apartment building, we would find check stubs where the money was paid for those things. So again, those are dollars that have actually been paid out. Then there's what is called reserves for replacement. The air conditioning system will break and need to be replaced. The heating system may need to be replaced. The roof is going to need to be replaced. Landscaping might need to be replaced. And a prudent property manager would be setting aside money every month so that when those things needed to be replaced, they would have a reserve account with enough money to do it. Now, if we went through the books of the apartment building, we're not going to find check stubs for that, because the reserves is not dollars that have been paid out. Those are simply dollars that have been set aside. And what we have when we're done with all this, is net operating income, and that is the income that is divided by the rate in order to determine the value. Supposing I have an apartment building in San Jose, but I live in San Diego. I travel up every month to look at my building in San Jose. I talk to the manager, I look at the books, I chat with some of the tenants. That trip back and forth every month, would that be a deduction? Would that be something the appraiser would deduct for when they're doing the minus expenses? If you say yes, then let me ask you this. Let's say instead of living in San Diego, I lived in New York City, and I came every month to look at my apartment building in San Jose. I guess we would deduct the cost of that too, wouldn't we? How about if I lived in Rio de Janeiro, and every month I flew first class to come and look at my 5-unit apartment building in the seedy part of San Jose? How much net income am I going to be showing? And the answer is nothing, because the cost of the plane ticket is greater than the amount of money you're producing in income. Would an appraiser say that an apartment building in San Jose has no value because the current owner lives in Brazil? Does that sound like something an appraiser is? Living in Brazil a necessary expense? Is this an expense to operate the property, or is this a personal expense? It sounds like that's a personal expense. That's not included. All right, no personal expenses. How about I have a loan on my property? I'm paying principal and interest. Would that be a deduction? Would that be a deduction? Now, if you're saying, well, yeah, that would be a deduction, maybe I should have told you that I had this really terrible loan. It's like an organized crime kind of loan. The interest rate's like 40%. It's really awful. Is the value of the apartment building determined by the current owner's financing? Would it be possible that the next owner might pay cash, have a different loan type? So that's why we say there are no deductions for PIPE. No deductions for principal, interest, or personal expenses. Now, some of you might be saying, well, wait a second, I know you can deduct some of those things. Maybe you're thinking of taxable income. When you're doing your taxes, are you paying it for next year? Are you paying taxes on future income? Is that what happens when you do your taxes? Or are you paying taxes on past income? You see, this is an epiphany for some people. We're not talking about the same money, because the net operating income is an anticipated future income stream, but income tax income is past income, not future income. Now, if you're doing your taxes, you would start with your net income. You would deduct interest payments up to a certain amount, but not principal, because the IRS doesn't consider that giving back the money you borrowed is a cost, right? Interest is a cost, but giving back the money is not a cost. Reasonable personal expenses, right? First class from Brazil, you're going to have trouble with that. But other, you have to convince the IRS if they audit you, your expenses were reasonable. And then there's this depreciation deduction, which I talk about in income tax class, where you can lower your taxable income. You end up with taxable income from which you pay your taxes. But there's a third set of books. And let's say your goal is to see if you're going to have enough money at the end of the year to buy a new car, right? A new Mercedes, something like that. Let's say you want to do that, a Tesla. So we would start with our net income, but we would deduct principal and interest. Now, principal payments are not a tax deduction, but it's really money we're spending. So we would include that. We would include interest. We would include all personal expenses. And the Department of Real Estate likes to ask on the exam, what's it called after you've done those deductions? And the answer is cash flow. They also like you to know that you pay your taxes from the cash flow, and what's left over is called net spendable. 3 sets of books without cheating the IRS or your partner yet. No deductions for PIPE, no deductions for principal, interest, or personal expenses. No deductions. There are questions on the exam. What about income tax? It's not a deduction. What about depreciation? Not a deduction, right? Not for the income approach. Adding a clubhouse, that's not a deduction, right? As an expense. It's a capital thing, a capital improvement. So annual net income. Capital expenditures are not considered. Not considered. I already covered that. Largest expense is always property taxes. Management is overlooked. There is always a management expense. Oh, wait a second. What if I manage it myself? If I manage it myself, then there's no management expense. Well, yeah, there still is, because there's lost opportunity. Assuming I could get a job from somebody else and they would pay me something, right? So my time does have an expense. And so what we would ask is, well, if you had to pay somebody to do it, what would that be? That's the management expense. Fixed expenses are taxes and insurance. Contract rent is based on leases, and economic rent is what the rent that a property would reasonably produce. The one we're doing now, some of the tenants have been there for a long time and they have below market value leases, right? That's what the contract says. But if we can get them out, we could raise the rent. That's economic rent. When the appraiser is doing it, they're looking at economic rent, what rent it would reasonably produce rather than what it is right now. You would ask, a buyer should ask a tenant to verify. This is called an estoppel certificate. Ground rent, and if an item of expenses increases, the value decreases more. Just a line on the state exam. And that's because of the rate. So if it's a 10% cap rate, it's basically telling you that there is a 10 times effect, right? Every dollar of income is worth $10 of value. So if an expense goes up by $5,000, the loss of income translates into 50,000 in terms of the loss of value. You might want to look at a reconstructed operating statement to determine what income is really being made, and vacancy levels can fluctuate. Then there's something called a gross multiplier. A gross multiplier is what's sometimes called a rule of thumb. It's a rough estimate of value. I sold a duplex some years ago, and it was in the city of Cupertino, which is a very expensive place to live. And the property was producing $100,000 in gross income. And the multiplier that was standard for multifamily, small multifamily in Cupertino at the time was 20. It's what's called an annual multiplier. So if you take $100,000 in gross income and you multiply it by 20, you end up with $2 million in value, 20 times what it produces every year in gross income. And it sold for $2,017,000. It was pretty close. So if you're looking at, let me put it this way. Sometimes it's hard to determine cap rates of similar buildings. We were doing this yesterday on this property in Fresno, right? 7 units. And the problem was, first of all, when we ran through multiple listing service, and most commercial properties aren't in, there are no sales. We tried a few other websites to see if we could get, there are none, but there are changes in title. In other words, I can identify a group of properties that kind of sort of look like ours that have sold in the last year or two in Fresno. They're all multifamily, residential, more than 5 apartments, that sort of a thing. And we know what they sold for because we know what the county recorder's office said was on the deed, right? The documentary transfer tax is paid, and anyhow, they know what it's all for. The problem is we don't know what the net income of any of these buildings were. We know the selling price, but we don't know the net income. If we knew the net income and we knew the selling price, that's called the comparison method, because we could determine the cap rates of the other properties, but we don't know any of the net income. So let's say you own one of those properties and I called you up, which is, by the way, we do this actually in commercial real estate. And I said, hi, my name's Mike. I'm a commercial real estate broker, and I'm working on a property with a client in your neighborhood where you, and I see that you purchased the property. Can you tell me what your net income is on this property? Could you tell me when you bought it what net income it was? Can you understand that some people might be reluctant to share that with somebody that just called them on the phone? They might be reluctant. So it's sometimes very difficult to find out what the comparable net incomes were because they don't want to tell us. But gross income, that's a lot easier. Because if we go back, we'll see when they were renting these properties, right? When they were looking for tenants and how much they said they wanted how much the rent would be, right? There's evidence of that. So we could determine gross income a little easier than net income. And we know the selling price and we know the gross income, and you see a bunch of them, selling price, gross income, selling price, gross, you come up with a multiplier. The gross multiplier is established by dividing the sales price by gross rents of comparable properties. We've covered two approaches. We covered last week the market data approach, which looks at past sales of similar properties. And we've just done the income approach. Supposing we're appraising an abandoned church building. Can we use market data, past sales of similar churches? I wonder how many churches sell in any given neighborhood or area. Probably not very many. So when we look, there are no past sales. There's no market data for churches. Okay, so that's not going to work. We can't use market data. Can we use the income approach? It's Episcopalian. No, sorry about that. No, it's an abandoned church building. It's not producing any, so we can't use the income approach. And there are no comparables, right? Because it's a unique kind of property. Well, what would we do? We would use the cost approach. And the cost approach asks the question, what would it cost us today to buy that land and build a similar building? And when we say build a similar building, we could be talking about either a reproduction or a replacement. Is there a difference between a reproduction versus a replacement? Is there a difference between those two? Well, let's say you're married and you'd like a new spouse, let's say. Is there a difference between getting a reproduction versus getting a replacement? Oh yeah, there's a big difference. Because if you get a reproduction, you're going to get exactly what you had before. That's what you're going to get. But if you get a replacement, well, that's different, right? Hopefully better. So a reproduction would ask, what would it cost us to make an exact replica of the building? Very few people care about that, right? A replacement would ask the question, what would it cost us to build a similar building? It's used on service buildings, public schools, cities, like things that we don't have any market data for, sets the upper limits of value. So if the fourplex costs $3 million, it's for sale, but you could buy the land and build a new one for 2.5. Well, you would just buy the land and build a new one, right? So the cost to buy land and build new ones, that's sort of the upper limit. It's more appropriate for appraising new buildings. The older the building is, the harder it is to determine the amount of depreciation. Reproduction, of course, is an exact replica. Replacement is the same utility. So the steps. Again, no math on the state exam, but I just thought, I will do the steps as an example. So we have this church building. We don't know what it's for. So we ask a contractor to come and take a look at the building. And the contractor looks at the building and the contractor says, I could build you a building like this for $300 a square foot. Now we know that our building is 10,000 square feet. So 10,000 times $300 is $3 million. $3 million would be the cost to replace the building new. But our building isn't new. It's all 5 years old. And let's say buildings like this have an economic life of about 50 years. That means on average, the building is losing 2% a year in terms of its value. That's how much it's depreciating, because 2 times 50 is 100. So if the building is 5 years old and it loses 2% a year, it's lost 10% of its value. And 10% of $3 million is $300,000. So we subtract the $300,000 for the accrued depreciation of the building. Then we add land value. Where do we get the land value? That's market data. What is land selling for? What is land worth? Let's say the land value is $400,000. Now we come up with our appraisal, the depreciated value of the improvements plus the value of the land. Again, on the state exam, you're not going to get a math question. But I don't know. I think it's easier. I gave you one as a bonus. So how do we determine the replacement cost? How do we determine that? It's also the building cost, the same thing. The easiest is called the square foot method, like the example I used, $300 a square foot. You need to know appraisers use exterior dimensions. I get this question asked by new real estate agents. When it says that the building is 2,000 square feet, is that inside or that outside of the building? The answer is it's outside of the building. This is fast and easy. Contractor says, oh, $300 a square foot. It's a comparative method because that's how much other people are building it for. The cost to build 2 stories is going to be less than a 1-story structure. It is less expensive to go up than it is to go out. The foundation is an expensive component. So having a second level is cheaper than doubling the footprint of the building. The square foot of a smaller house is usually higher. I teach agents about how to determine the market value of property. And one of the things you have to be careful of, if you're appraising a 1,400 square foot property, you don't want to be using 1,000 square foot or 900 square foot or even 1,100, because smaller properties have higher dollar per square foot value or cost. Why is that? And the answer is because there are certain components of the building, the heating and the cooling and kitchens and things like that, that are, the fact that the building is twice the size does not mean that the air conditioner is twice the size, or the heater is twice the size, or the kitchen is twice the size. So some of the expensive components, as the building gets bigger, are spread out over more square feet. I'm just saying. Cubic foot is not used very often. Unit in place. So our contractor said, oh, $300 a square foot. Oh, Bill, I could build you a building like that. Is it possible that our contractor could be off a little? Is that possible? That the contractor's $300 a square foot could be off just a teensy bit, maybe. It could be off a lot. So would it be more accurate if instead of letting the general contractor say $300 a square foot, we got all of the subcontractors essentially together, and we said, well, what is it going to cost to put in the foundation, and what is it going to cost to put in the floors and walls, and what is it going to cost to put in the electrical, and what will it cost to put in the plumbing? And you understand what we're doing now is we're getting estimates for each of the major components of the building, and that's called the unit in place. Not used by appraisers. It's just something that is in appraisal textbooks and appears in the state exam. The quantity survey is the most detailed. The quantity surveys, we get the blueprints out. And we say, all right, here are the blueprints. What is it going to cost? How much lumber are we going to need? How many board feet of lumber are we going to need? How many cubic yards of concrete are we going to need? How many hours of labor are we going to need? How many nails are we going to need? The quantity survey counts nails, very detailed. It is a detailed estimate, but nobody uses it. Depreciation. Because remember, we start with what would it cost us today to build a new building. Then we subtract depreciation. Depreciation in appraisal is loss of value due to any cause. Only improvements depreciate, not the land. Accountants look at book depreciation, but appraisers look at actual depreciation. Accrued, that means accumulated depreciation, is very difficult to measure. So there are, when you take the state exam, there are 3 types of depreciation. There is the appraiser, there is the IRS, and then there's an accountant. Those are the 3 types. And what gets confusing for the state exam is that they will ask questions about depreciation, and all of these 3 use the word depreciation, but they are not talking about the same thing. So an appraiser, depreciation is loss of value, which, as I've noted, is a bad thing. Your appraiser calls you up and says, yeah, that property got downtown. It's got a lot of depreciation. That's bad. That's a bad thing to hear. How is that determined? How is it measured? Whose eyes are they looking through when they say you have a lot of depreciation? And the answer is in the eyes of the market, because the market is saying that property is going down in value. Now, your tax person calls you up afterwards and says, hey, you know that building you have downtown? It's got a lot of depreciation. To the IRS, depreciation is cost recovery. So if you bought a property for $5 million and $4 million of it went to the improvements, the IRS is going to allow you to take the $4 million that went to the improvements and deduct it from your taxable income over a certain number of years, 27.5 if it's residential property, 39 if it's non-residential property. And so the IRS says that what they're doing is they're helping you recover your cost by allowing you to deduct your cost from your taxable income. That's good, because it gives you a tax deduction without having to have an expense. So they're not talking about the same thing. The appraiser is saying you got a lot of depreciation, that's bad. And the IRS is saying you got a lot of depreciation, that's good. Right? Because although the word is still the same word, they're not talking about the same thing. Now, less so is the accountant. And the accountant uses the phrase book value, which is neither good nor bad. Right? They're accountants. It's not good, it's not bad. If you have a business and you buy a $100,000 truck and you're going to use it for 10 years, you would maybe allocate the $100,000 over the 10 years that you're going to use the truck. That's not good necessarily. It's not bad. It's just, the way of doing business. So we're talking today, though, about appraisal depreciation, and there are 3 types of causes. There's physical, functional, and economic and social. Physical is deterioration, wear and tear, right? A leaky roof, a bad foundation. It's said to be inherent inside, in that it's inside the property lines. Functional is a type of obsolescence. Functional is a type of obsolescence. And economic and social is a type of obsolescence. And functional means that there is a design problem. There's a design problem. It's also inside the property lines. Economic and social is anything that is outside the property lines. So physical are inherent causes, wear and tear, not obsolescence. Deferred maintenance is an example. Functional are also inherent, and usually we're talking about a design problem. Now, some of the examples they've used on the state exam was poor architectural style and design. A massive cornice. What's that? Something you get in your eye? Something on your feet? A heart condition? No, no. If you've seen like a really old building, like maybe an old movie theater, and along the roof there's this decorative strip, sometimes gold leaf, and then at the corners are gargoyle heads and things like that. Those things are called cornices, not really in style anymore. Lack of modern facilities, like no air conditioning, would be a functional issue. Changes in construction styles. So there's the question where the answer, which of the following is functional, is a one-car garage, right? What's a one-car, and yeah, I've taught these classes in San Francisco, and I've had people from San Francisco go through my classes, and a lot of times people from San Francisco are saying, well, what is crazy, a one-car garage, that's going to add value, right? It doesn't lower your value, not in San Francisco, it adds value. Yeah, maybe that's true in San Francisco, but the Department of Real Estate is not writing their test from the point of view of a person living in San Francisco. This is hard to convince people in San Francisco that it's not this way. And so outside of San Francisco, if you have a one-car garage, that's not enough. That's going to be a minus, not a plus. Incompatible orientation. Do people care if the property is facing north, south, east, west, northwest, southwest? Yeah, and that's a functional problem, right? Because it's turned the wrong way. There's a question in the state exam about two adjacent properties. They had the same building costs, but they had different values. And the answer as to why is probably a design issue in one of the buildings. Economic or social is external. Anything outside the property lines. Over improving the property, which is also called the principle of regression, right? Regression means you built the most expensive home in the neighborhood. It's pulled down by the value of the homes around it. Zoning is an example. Changing the flight patterns, nuisances in the area. A prospering neighborhood could help prevent economic obsolescence, because the prospering neighborhood, if you have a house, are you unhappy if you see that all your neighbor houses start to get run down and they're not fixing anything and they're not doing the lawns? And yeah, so a prospering neighborhood prevents economic obsolescence. This is the most difficult to eliminate because it's everybody else around you, and it's hard to make them change. And the phrase, more buildings are torn down than fall down, really is referring to economic obsolescence. So obsolescence is the major cause of depreciation. It is a cause, but not a method of providing for. It's just a question on the exam, providing for. It's not that, it's a cause of depreciation. It can either, depreciation can be curable or incurable. Curable means economic and physically possible. If you said to a contractor, could you turn the house around so it's facing in another direction? The contractor says, how much money do you have? Well, you understand, the contractor would say, sure, I could do that, but it may not be economically feasible. So incurable means it is too expensive or physically impossible. And the Department of Real Estate likes to ask questions. Is this curable? Is it incurable? So an improper improvement would be incurable functional obsolescence. Because what are you going to do? The poor design, the building is facing the wrong direction. And all the buyers with their compasses out go, no, we don't want to buy it. Wear and tear on load-bearing components would be incurable and physical. Physical and functional are usually curable. Economic and social, usually not. So how would we determine the amount of accrued depreciation? Straight line, I already gave you an example of that. Remember, the building had a 50-year life, which means that it wears out at 2% a year, and it's 5 years old, which means it's lost 10%. That's straight line. Economic life. It's the useful life of the improvements, usually shorter than physical. Could be known as theoretical. It is remaining from the period of the appraisal date. The buyer is concerned with this. It is the length of time that the building remains viable. It would depend on a lot of things. How old is the building? How is it being used? Is it being maintained? Things like that. And depreciation is based upon expired economic life. 50-year life, losing 2% a year, 5 years old, 10% is expired economic life. Effective age. Effective age is, well, what's the difference? Supposing I had two buildings built 20 years ago downtown. Buildings are the same layout, design, and square footage. The only real difference between these two buildings is who the tenants have been for the last 20 years. One of the buildings has been rented to a book and art co-op, and they have book readings and poetry readings and oboe players and tea things and things like that. That's one of the buildings. The other building has been used as a college fraternity for the last 20 years. Now, in a sense, you could say these two buildings are the same age, in that they were both built and completed at the same time. But effectively, one of these buildings is showing a bit more wear than the other. So when we say that a building is 5 years old, remember my example, there's a 50-year life, which means 2% a year, and the building is 5 years old. When we say that a building is 5 years old, do we mean that a building is really 5 years old? Or do we mean that the building is effectively 5 years old? And the answer is we mean the building is effectively 5 years old. Effective age, and you would use it instead of actual age when you could. Other methods of estimating depreciation, what would it cost us to cure and fix everything that's wrong? It's just, that 7-unit multifamily, our list of things we're asking them to fix, it was built in the 1920s, is like several pages long. We also could use the sales method, which would say, all right, what would the cost to build new improvements be, right? What would the land value, we would subtract the land value from the sales price to arrive at the sales price of the improvements. And the difference between the cost new and the sales price of the improvements is the amount of accrued depreciation. So if we knew that a brand new building like ours would sell for $5 million, but that building, like the ones we're looking at as a comparable, sold for $4.5 million. and we know that land, let's to make it easy, is $1 million. What we would know is that that $500,000 drop in value from a new building to a used building is the amount of accrued depreciation. And we could calculate each year how much it's depreciating. And then we would use that as an example. Provision for future depreciation. This is called accruals for depreciation. Remember that 5% a year, because the building had a 20-year life, so it was 5% a year for 20 years. That straight line. Sinking fund, that's that Inwood guy, where we put money aside every year that would pay for improvements when they need to be. And then we have estimating the value of land. It's usually by comparison. Comparison means market data. There's something called front foot value. Front foot value is the total value divided by the front footage. Frontage is a distance measurement. The deeper the lot, the greater the front foot value. I got an example. Depth tables would be used in commercial properties, and they sometimes follow what's called the 4-3-2-1 rule, which is used in appraising vacant land, where lots have different depths. Now, over the years, I've sometimes had a math example, sometimes didn't have an example. This isn't a heavily tested area on the state exam, but you can get a question on it. And I just thought this would be worth going through. So we have 4 lots, vacant lots right next to each other. The first one is 100 feet across, 400 feet deep, and is worth $100,000. Now, if you do the math, first of all, if it's $100,000 and it's 100 feet across the top, then that means it's worth $1,000 a front foot. Now, front foot, some people say it's a weird kind of way. If you paid $1,000 per front foot, are you only getting the front foot? No, you get the whole lot. It just in certain types of property, commercial properties, and valuing land, sometimes it's quoted by how much you're charging per front foot. Now, the square foot, if we took 100 times 400 and then divided that into 100,000, is only $2.50 per square foot. So the deeper lot is worth 1,000 front feet, but only 2.5 square feet. The next lot is 1/4 less in size, 3/4. It's got, again, 100 feet across the front, 300 feet deep, and it's worth 90,000. So it's only worth $900 a front foot. Notice the front foot value went down. Why? Because there's less behind each front foot. But the square foot value went up. And that's because land becomes less valuable as you go deeper, right? Because there's a certain point where you reach the point of maximization. Going deeper, the back half is not worth as much as the front half. The third one is still 100 feet across, 200 feet deep. It's worth 70,000. It's $700 a front foot, so it's worth a lot less per front foot. But notice it's worth a lot more per square foot because it's on more valuable land. And finally, we have the 100 by 100. It's only worth $400 per square foot, but it's worth $400 a front foot, but it's worth $4 a square foot. 4-3-2-1. Now, if you're thinking, well, that was more than I wanted to know about this. Oh, well, I'm not done. So if you look at this chart and then you look at this chart, as depth increases from normal, square foot value goes down, front and total value go up. As the depth decreases from normal, square foot value goes up, but front foot and total value go down. A residual method is when we're residual, like from residue, is when we're using a different capitalization rate for land and buildings. Remember, I mentioned that land does not have a limited economic life. It doesn't wear out and die. We don't need a return of the investment. So there's something called a land residual method, which determines the value of the land separately from the value of the building. And the building residual method, well, it would help you determine the value of the building. You might have guessed that just from looking at their names. And the property residual method, which is what we've been discussing today, is where it's an overall cap rate, right? Which is what we've been doing. The development method is you're appraising vacant land. The appraiser estimates the value of the land and improvements when sold. So the appraiser say, well, if we built, what would be the highest and best use for this property? And we built it, what would it sell for? And then we'll deduct the cost of the building, and whatever's left over is the land value. And distribution is really not an appraisal thing. It's using the property tax bill, because the property taxes separate the value of the building and the value of the land, right? But it's not like the tax assessor went and looked at the property to determine this. It's just a ratio that they use. We're going to talk about something a little bit different now. Construction terms. Should a real estate agent understand different kinds of construction terms? I would say so, because people, buyers and sellers, investors, contractors will refer to something. When I got my real estate license, which was maybe a little while ago, I remember I had a buyer and I had printed out termite reports, and I gave a copy to the buyer and I had a copy, and I was reading it. I learned not to do this for the first time in front of the client. And the client was a faster reader than I was. And so I'm reading the, termite report, and the buyer says, "What's a soffit?" And I was like, And it says here, there's dry rot on the soffit. What's that? I did not know. Now, a soffit is the underside of an eaves. So did that make me look good that I didn't know what the things were that were being referred to in the termite report? It doesn't make it look good. So the Department of Real Estate asks terms about certain kinds of construction terms. They ask about it. So backfill is used in excavations to fill in or brace a foundation. Fill back in. So they dig a trench or the foundation, fill back, that's called backfill. A beam is a large structural member transversely supporting a load at right angles to a girder, and usually supported by a girder, also called the joist. All right, so I have a couple of diagrams. The first, joists are all parallel beams. So there are floor joists and there are ceiling joists, right? I'm just thought I would explain what a joist is. This diagram shows all the girders and the beams. So remember, it said it was transversely supporting a load. So a beam, so notice how the beams go one way, right? And then the girders go the other way, right? So the girder is going like this and the beams are going on top of the girder, right? The girder is transversely supporting a load. The bearing wall is not a wall that separates Alaska from Russia. That's not what we mean. It's not that kind of a wall. I don't know how you build it there, but anyhow, a bearing wall is a wall that bears the weight of the building. It says you might want to think about these things before you move them. And which walls are the bearing walls? They're the walls that go up first, because they put them up first because they're the walls that bear the weight of the building. A board foot, you might think that's what I get when I'm standing in line at the bank. You know, I've been there for 10 minutes and I can't feel my toes moving anymore, but that's not what we mean, not that kind of a foot. A board foot is a measurement of wood, and it's 144 cubic inches is one board foot. BTU stands for British Thermal Unit. The old joke used to be in England that it stood for better than underwear. British, it's a measurement of heat, right? It's a heat measurement. A building permit is an indirect building cost in that it's a cost, but it's not wood and it's not electrical or something like that. Compaction means to compact the dirt down to, and this is called fill dirt, and you're pressing it down. That's called compaction. You would want to get a report on soil stability from a civil engineer if the building foundation has cracks and doors and windows do. That's a crack house. So there's a question in the state exam, the house has doors and windows that don't close properly and cracks in the foundation, and you would get a soils engineering report. Conduit is pipe that electrical wiring goes through, installed by electricians. Corrective maintenance is ordinary repairs. The crawl space is the space under the house where you can crawl. Most building codes say it has to be 18 inches. Dark colors, these are just alphabetical things, been on the test, often make a room look smaller. Deciduous, the way, how did deciduous come on the state exam? The question was, which of the following is not a type of soil? That was the question. Which of the following is not a type of soil? And they had alkaline and sandy, and one of the choices was deciduous. And deciduous is not a type of soil. Drywall is made out of gypsum as opposed to wet wall. It used to be the walls were lath and plaster, but now it's wall board. An elevation sheet is an architect's drawings, shows the front and side views of the subdivision. Energy efficiency ratio, think of it like miles per gallon. The higher the ratio, the better, right? Just like the higher the miles per gallon. Flashing is sheet metal. When I was in college, it had a different meaning. And so here's an example of all the different kinds of flashing, right? Not all, but most of them you could find. So you'll see that there's metal in the ridge here, which is the valley, and that's flashing. There's flashing around the window dormers. There's flashing that's metal around the skylight. There's metal around the fireplace. There's metal around the, you get the idea. All of that is called flashing. The foundation is a spreading base or bottom of a foundation wall, and that's called footing, excuse me. The spreading base of a foundation wall. And a foundation is supporting portion of the structure below the first floor construction. And the foundation plan would show this. So examples, the one on the left here is footing, right? So footing, if you look at the right, see the diagram on the right, imagine the slab is gone. This part here, that's what you're looking at, the part that is sticking up out of the ground. Now, it's not obvious when you're looking at the picture on the right, but that doesn't just go straight down when they poured the concrete. It goes down and it goes out a little bit. And that creates, well, the footing. And all of this from the bottom up to the top, this is called footing, right? What you're looking at here is called footing. Now, what you're looking underneath that is the foundation. And these aren't all pictures of the same property, but anyhow, if we then put the foundation up here, that's what that would look like, right? So we have the footing, which is the spreading base at the bottom. Foundation goes on top of the footing. Like in this example, it's slab, so it doesn't go up high, but it's still on top of the footing. And the part between the footing and the floor joist would be going right across the top. That's the foundation. And a foundation plan is another architect's drawing that shows you the layout of the footings, the piers, all that stuff. A header. When I first did this, my diagram, my picture of a header, well, I used Stonehenge. I used Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is a good example of a header. You've got all these rocks that are sticking up and big heavy ones on top. Now, so it's used in lieu of a lintel. All right, so here's an example of a window header. So here's the window frame. The window header is the wood member extending between two or more members. So this is one and this is the other, and that's the header. Now lintels, you see these are these different diagrams. This one's see that part right above the door or the window, right? That's called a lintel, right? And a lintel, again, is above, and, you know, it's sort of like a beam that goes across the top. HVAC is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Insulation is measured by R value. And R value is the insulation's resistance to the flow of heat. And again, like miles per gallon, the higher the R value, the better. Federal law requires that new home sellers disclose in every sales contract the type, thickness, and R value of the insulation. Joists, as I mentioned, are parallel. They're parallel beams. Joist means parallel. That's an example of a whole bunch. It could be floor joists or ceiling joists or wall joists. It's a whole bunch of them. A kiosk. I get asked, why is this on the test? The word kiosk is a Russian word that means an information booth. Why is this on the real estate exam? It's Coldwell Banker's fault. A long time ago, Coldwell Banker was owned by Allstate Insurance. And Allstate Insurance also owned a company called Sears, which had stores in the mall. So Allstate Insurance also bought Coldwell Banker, and they owned Sears. And so somebody said, you know, it would be a great idea if we put a Coldwell Banker kiosk in every Sears store. And it used to be a long time ago that every Sears store had a little Coldwell Banker kiosk, and real estate agents could stand there. You know, I like to remind my Coldwell Banker friends of when, you know, they were in Sears. Well, there isn't Sears anymore, and Coldwell Banker is not owned by Allstate Insurance. And yet the Department of Real Estate still has the question on the exam. That's when the question appeared on the exam. And this is a picture, not that old, of a mall. It's obviously of a mall, and that's a real estate office kiosk in a mall. Hence why it's on the test. Offsite improvements are not located on the parcel. The party wall, right? I guess it's called that so you can hear the party on the other side of the wall. It's between two adjoining properties. A percolation test is a soil analysis that is looking at how water percolates through the ground, like a coffee maker percolates, and that the hot water goes through the ground and makes the coffee. It was the original juicing, right? The hot water goes through the grounds. That's called percolation. That's what the test is. It would be made before septic tanks are installed. And they don't ask about the details on the state exam, but they drill a hole, they fill it with water, right? They have a ruler, they cap it, and they come back, they see if the water level has gone down. And if it is, it's percolating. A plot map or plot plan is another architectural drawing that shows the location of the house and other structures. And this is just an example of a plot plan. Potable is a word that means water that can be used for drinking. And if you want to put in a new home subdivision, then the Department of Real Estate wants to know where you're getting your potable water from. The rafter is a series of boards to support the roof. Rehabilitation restores buildings to original condition, and remodeling is changing the plan, form, or style. So if you have an old Victorian and you rehabilitate it, it means you have original kitchens, Wedgwood stoves and things like that. You know, the shower is a bathtub with one of those things, you know, and the plastic that goes around. Remodeling means you tear out the kitchen, put in a new kitchen, tear out the bathrooms, put in a new bathroom. And the ridge board is the highest structural point in a frame house. And this is a picture of them installing a ridge board, right? That's what a ridge board looks like. Roofs, gable, slopes on two sides. Gambrel is double pitched. Hip slopes on four sides. And a mansard is a double pitched on four sides. All right. So I have a diagram I'll get to. The steeper slope is a longer life. Think of an A-frame house. So the slope, like if it was a boxy style, then it's a flat roof. But if it's an A-frame, that's a steep slope. And that's very good for weathering the weather, right? For wind and rain and snow and things like that. It has a longer life. So these are the types of roofs and that the Department of Real Estate has been known. Now, out of this group, the four middle ones are the only ones that appear on the state exam with any frequency. This diagram came from the Department of Real Estate. So they're interested in that you know the difference between a gable roof and a hip roof. Look at those two, gable and hip. So the hip roof, and in our area in California, there's a lot of what are called ranch hips. And ranch hips are wider. They slope down at the front, they slope down at the back, and then they slope down at the sides. The gable slopes down at the front and down at the back, but they don't slope down at the sides. It drops off at the end. And that part that drops off forms a triangular shape, and the triangular shape is called the gable. The gambrel is double pitched, which means it goes up at one pitch and then it goes up again at another. It looks like a barn. Cape Cod houses usually have more than one pitch, but it's only on two sides. The mansard is an older European look where all four sides slope up, but then it's flat on the top, usually recessed around where the roof is. I was showing homes in a very expensive neighborhood to a client who bought a very expensive house. And we were looking in this neighborhood and he points over at this house and he says, "What style is that house? What architectural style is that house?" And I looked at it and I said, "Well, it's not so much the style, that's a mansard roof." And of course, his cell phone was, oh yeah, then he's showing pictures of, you know, to his children. It might be good to know some of those things when you're talking to clients, especially if they ask, because they're going to check on their phone and see, you know, right away. All right. Schematics are architectural drawings. Sheathing is usually, it's over the exterior, studs or rafters of the building. It's plywood usually, or wall board. It's the boards that they staple to the wall joists and things like that when they're building a house. The sill or the mud sill is the lowest part of a frame house. So I don't have a diagram for that, I used to, but we have the foundation when the wood hits the foundation. That's called the sill. Soil pipe is for waste. The sole plate is not the special at the fish market, but it's a board on which walls and partition studs rest. So you have the foundation. You have a board, oftentimes a 2x4, on top of the foundation. And on top of that, you have walls, other joists that are coming up for the walls, and that's called the sole plate, the one at the bottom where the partition studs rest on it. Square footage, if we're looking at inside measurements, if we're talking about floor area square footage, that's inside measurements. But normally when they're talking about square footage, it's the outside measurements. Studs are vertical supporting timbers in walls and partitions. They can't be more than 16 inches apart. A substandard building is a building that lacks heating or has defective weather protection. If it's old and safe, it's not substandard, right? Not substandard. And a tenant improvement allowance is what you would give on a shell space where the landlord agrees to spend money to upgrade. And what is a shell space? If you've ever driven around where they're building new retail buildings, and so they built the building and it's all glass around on the one side, and you'll see it's one great big building, but there's like 4 doors put in, but there's no walls. Why not? Because they don't know how much space a tenant wants. Supposing you had one of those buildings and Starbucks came by and Starbucks said, we're willing to sign a long-term lease, but we want you to put a wall here and we want to put the door there. But you'd probably do it because they would probably be a good tenant. Termites. So the most common termite is drywood, but subterranean termites are the ones that are most damaging. And that's because it's easier to kill the drywood termites because they're above the ground, but the subterranean ones are in the ground, which makes them more difficult to kill. You'll hear the terms Section 1 clearance and Section 2 clearances when we're talking about termite reports. And just to be clear, although we call them termite reports, it's really a pest inspection report. And if you read it, you will see that what a pest inspection report looks at are wood destroying pests and organisms. Wood destroying pests and organisms. So termites is a pest that eats wood. And there's 2 kinds, the dry wood that fly around and the subterranean that live in the ground. Fungus is another example because fungus is an organism that eats the wood, not mold. Mold does not eat wood, but fungus eats wood. And number 3, rot. When wood is rotting, what's actually happening is microorganisms are eating the wood. So what a Section 1 clearance means that we have eliminated all wood destroying pests and organisms, which would include termites, fungus, and rot. Section 2 means we don't actually have an infestation of wood destroying pests and organisms right now, but we could, because there's excessive moisture under the house where the wood is, there's wood chips around the house, there's things that if left alone would likely result in wood destroying pests and organisms. Termite reports, State Structural Pest Control Board, copies can be obtained by anyone. We're in this one transaction, the seller was saying, well, yeah, we have a termite report, but we won't show it to you until you've written an offer and we've accepted the offer. And the buyer's saying, oh, I really wish I could see it. And I said, just give me a few minutes and go to their website. You can get a copy of the report. They're kept for 2 years. The broker should see that the buyer receives it as soon as practical. They're required with FHA and VA loans. A copy must be given to the owner. And you should probably do this before you put the house on the market to see, there's termite damage. Toxic waste report is now called a phase 1 environmental. And the most common example in the state exam is a property next to an abandoned gas station. And toxic waste report is a generic term, but in California, it's more recently, not just in California, it's called the phase 1 environmental. Turnkey means you can just turn the key and move in, right? The tenant can move right in is turnkey. Wainscoting is this diagram down here, which is a finished fancy area in the lower part of the wall. And walk up means, there's no elevator, right? Walk up means no elevator. Occasionally there's questions about the contractor licensing board, not a lot. Most common question is that if it's $500 or more, you need to have a contractor's license. Most common question. Architectural styles, the most common question here is there's a question about vertical, horizontal, parallel lines, large windows in the front of the house. And the question is, what kind of architectural style is that? And the answer is contemporary. And that's an example. Notice the parallel lines and large windows in the front. Cape Cod has that double pitch. Right, it's a type of, it's a gambrel roof, double pitched. You see this angle, and that angle. They're not quite the same, right? There's a different levels, and that's called the gambrel roof. That's a Cape Cod style. Mediterranean, some of these you might be interested. Red tile roofs, oftentimes ranch. This one is a really ranchy looking ones. Most of the ones in my area don't look that ranch-like, but you get the idea. And Victorian, looks like an old Victorian. I don't know. That's pretty much what it looks like. The answer typically on the state exam is contemporary, right? But the choices are all of these others. So I thought I would cover them so that you could see them. All right. That's the end of tonight's discussion on appraisal. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through briefly how the course works. For those of you that are just starting, don't know, or about to take the state exam, if you've already gone through this, you don't need to sit through it again, but you're welcome to. So in order to get a real estate license, you have to do 3 things. You have to complete 3 college level courses in real estate. You don't have to go to college. They're all included in the program. You have to 2, pass a test given by the California Department of Real Estate. And then number 3, you can apply to get a license. Now the 3 college courses, one of them has to be real estate principles, one of them has to be real estate practice, and the third one would be an elective. And the elective can be chosen from anything on this list. Now our program includes legal aspects of real estate because it's the most useful one of this list. However, if you've ever taken accounting, economics, or business law from a junior college or better, and you can get your hands on a copy of the transcripts, it doesn't have to be an original. We're not applying to Harvard. Then you've already got the 3rd course, but legal aspects is included in our package anyhow. Now, you're supposed to have 135 hours of pre-license training, 3 45-hour courses, 3 of them. And we're affiliated with a company that is approved by the California Department of Real Estate to issue the certificates of completion that you need in order to go take the state exam. The whole program, this whole component is done online. Now there's a final exam for each of the 3 courses. So there's 3 college level courses, which means there's 3 final exams. And the final exams are all online final exams. You can take them at home and they're open book tests. Let me cover that one more time. 3 college courses, 3 final exams. Each final exam is an online, at home, open book, cheat as much as you want to. Final exam, you can cheat as much as you want to. They give you 3 hours to get 75 out of 100 questions right. Did I mention that this is an open book test? Right? And so the reason and by the way, they being the Department of Real Estate, makes you wait 18 days from the day you start a course before you can take the final exam. Why do they make you wait? By the way, you don't have to take the final exam in 18 days. It's just that you can't take the final exam any sooner than 18 days. Why would they do this? And the answer is because you can pass your first day. You understand, if you enrolled today and you got a copy of the textbook and internet connection in 3 hours, you could look up 75 answers just starting cold, which this is supposed to be 3 45-hour classes, and that would make it look ridiculous. So they make you wait 18 days. That's not the hard part of getting a real estate license. The online open book, cheat as much as you want to college course is not the hard part. The hard part is passing the real estate exam given by the Department of Real Estate. It's 3 hours long, 150 multiple guess, I mean, multiple choice questions. And it's not an online at-home test. You got to go to one of the Department of Real Estate's testing facilities. They are in Fresno and San Diego, Los Angeles, it's Orange County, Oakland, and Sacramento. You have to physically go there. You're not allowed to cheat. They're watching you. It's not an open book test. You need to score at least 70% of the questions right in order to pass, which, if you think about it, isn't a particularly high score to require. I mean, if your brain surgeon told you that they had gotten 70% of the questions right when they were tested on brain surgery, that wouldn't sound very good, because that means there was 30% they didn't know. So this, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to get a real estate license. Some of you may have already figured that out. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to get a real estate license. All you have to do is get 70% of the answers right and you're in. Having said that, over 50% of the people who take the test fail it. Every time the Department of Real Estate gives their exam, they fail. More than half the people in the room, many of whom they have failed before. You can take the test an unlimited number of times. So all of these people that are failing, by the way, we need to keep in mind all of the people that are failing were able to successfully complete those 3 online open book, cheat as much as you want to college courses. They all were able to do that, because they won't even let you take the state exam without doing the 3 college courses. My point is, doing the 3 college courses does not mean you're going to get a real estate license. It simply means you've done the minimum amount necessary in order to go take a shot at the exam. That's why I teach people how to pass the real estate exam. I have 12 classes. They're on Wednesday nights from 6:30 to 8:45, focused on what we know the Department of Real Estate wants you to know. They're broadcast on the internet and recorded. It's like a pizza, warm and cheesy. It's also like a pizza in that there is no first slice. You can start with any one, you can take them in any order. They're independent modules. They don't build on each other. They're all equally confusing at first, and you can just jump into the cycle at any point. The total investment for the whole program is $398. It gives you the 12 live classes, video replays, course outline, practice testing. The college level courses are included, and a Saturday cram class. I have really good reviews because I have a really high pass rate. I'm focused on California. Virtually everyone who goes through the course passes the exam. I encourage people to try a lesson as a guest. I'm with a company called EXP. We're a cloud-based brokerage. I have agents all over the state of California on my team, and we can talk about how that works once you've gotten your license. How long does this take? Each college level course takes a minimum of 18 days, right? Because you can't take the final exam until after 18 days. That would be 54 days to get through the 3 college courses. It would take you, let's say today I got my last certificate of completion and I applied to take the real estate exam. It's going to be 4 to 6 weeks before I'm actually taking the test. While I'm waiting to get a test date, I would do fingerprint processing. So that 6 weeks would run while I'm waiting to take the exam. Once I pass the exam, it's going to take a couple of weeks before the Department of Real Estate even issues me the license. So the whole thing is going to take 4 to 6 months it's going to take 4 to 6 months. What does it cost to get into real estate? $398 for the course, license preparation, state exam, and to have your license issued is $305. Fingerprints and processing is about $75. $778 gets you in. Other fees, it's about $675 a year and about $850 a year for the multiple listing service. It may vary depending on which area you're in, but not by a huge amount. Our average commission, by the way, is way more than $20,000 Thought I'd throw that out. After you get your license, it's good for 4 years, and every 4 years you have to take 45 hours of continuing education to renew. If you wanted to sign up now, and who wouldn't want to sign up now, you'd go to my website, click on the sign up now button, which is at dreclass.com. If you're just getting started and you've never taken college level courses before, you want the first option for $398. If you're about to take the state exam and you've done everything else, it's only $99 because you've already got all that other stuff and you just need the Saturday workshop and the practice testing. The middle one is for people that have taken the college level courses a long time ago and they don't remember anything, don't know very much, and they want to go through, they don't need to redo the college courses because those are good forever, but they want to go through the rest of the program. That's only $299. If you have any questions, reach out to us, email, phone number. I have a link where you could set up an appointment to talk to me. It's a calendar link, and I like talking to people about getting into real estate. Any questions, reach out to us. Otherwise, have a great evening, day, and unlike keep saying, have a great day and stay safe out there. Goodbye.